Potential Not Pathology, embracing creative and resourceful approaches to psychotherapy with author and therapist Dr. Paul J. Leslie.
Welcome to Potential Not Pathology, where we offer information and inspiration for mental health therapists who are interested in learning and applying unique therapeutic techniques and concepts into their work. With a focus on the potential each client brings to his or her therapy session, this program examines ideas and tools which can assist your clients on their journey toward healing. I'm Paul J. Leslie. Thank you for being with me. This is our third podcast, and I'm learning more and more about technology. I'm learning more and more about upgrading equipment. So hopefully every time you listen, we'll get a little bit better in some of the things we're doing. I am hoping that each time you listen, you get a little nugget of information and a nice listening experience, something that you can use with your clients. And with that in mind, I thought today I'd talk a little bit about pattern alteration. Playing with patterns. I have found that a lot of times people, when they are performing their work as therapists, forget the behavioral element to therapy. I found a lot of times there are well-meaning therapists who identify themselves as cognitive behavioral therapists, and they totally forget the whole behavioral component sometimes. And I think that we are more made up of patterns than we like to think. I mean, there's a whole, spiritual idea, I think, in Buddhism of, there's no self, and it's all these kind of reactions and to stimuli that makes us who we are. And I don't know if I'll go that full route, but I do think that a lot of times when our clients come in to see us, we need to instead of just paying attention to their thought patterns, which is important, and to their emotions, which is important, we need to start thinking about their actions, specifically working at the level of the action. I've kind of viewed thoughts and emotions and actions as intertwined, and it turns into this kind of this recursive pattern, so that if you adjust in thinking, sometimes you can indirectly adjust emotion, and emotion indirectly adjust action. And if you change in the emotion, that can change thinking, and you change the thinking, you can change action. A lot of the thought and emotional interventions take some time, and you can get a lot of mileage out of them. What I found that where we can start to help our clients a little bit faster is to help them begin to alter their limiting behavioral patterns. The great Milton Erickson had a quote that was that having insight rarely leads to change, but change can oftentimes lead to insight. So instead of trying to get clients to only, understand why they're doing what they're doing, we need to start giving them changes and shifts in their behavioral patterns to move them toward resources that can help them. Now, when somebody comes in and they're having a mental health issue, if we were to step back and look at the pattern of what they're presenting, there are certain actions that sometimes we can do to just get them doing something different that can decrease the severity of the problem they're presenting. Now, this in of itself might not totally eradicate the problem, or it might. And so if we can only utilize this to help somebody get 30% better, well, I think that's a great thing. I think we need to use that. So having a client sit down with us and tell us, let's just use Let's use depression. I actually had a client tonight, very nice lady, who came in with depression. She's depressed about her job, depressed about her life. She's got stuff happened in the past that really upsets her, and now it's kind of having an effect. Well, she's thinking even of taking a leave of absence from work because she's feeling so depressed. Well, if it's gotten to that level of severity, we might do something a little, how do I put this, dramatic. We might need to really shake up some of the patterns that she's showing us. So I decided that what we're going to do is to sit down and figure out exactly how she does depression. Now, this is where we have to really step back and look at being versus doing. When somebody says, I am depressed, a lot of times they take that on at the level of their identity. If they have experienced being depressed long enough, they may begin to think that's who they are. You probably have had a client that says, I can't remember when I wasn't depressed or anxious or whatever the presenting issue is, because it's happened so long that it's kind of a way of life for them. So when somebody says I am depressed, we need to, as therapists, sometimes bear in mind that doesn't mean that that's all they are. That might mean that they're actually doing depression, because to be depressed, you have to have a certain pattern. And maybe that pattern is at the neurological level, certain firings of neurons or not firing of neurons. But at the same time, on the outside, you find if you actually sit down with someone and you take inventory of what they're doing, what is it like to do depression, you'll find that there's some specific shifts in their behavior that has either created this or has added to what was already there, making it worse. So what I do a lot of times is I'll have a whiteboard, to erasable board to write things down on, and I'll say, okay, so if I had to be you for a day and I had to do depression, what are the things I would do? And a lot of times they'll say, well, first thing is that I don't go out much. And so I'll write down, stay at home. Then they may say, well, I don't talk to people like I used to. I kind of, stay by myself and I don't interact. So then I write down isolate. Then they'll say something like, I just don't do any of the things I used to do. I just kind of sit and watch TV or play on the computer or just sleep too much. And so then I write not move much. So I get basically a recipe of how to do depression. So after the recipe's completed, I asked them, I said, look, I'm not depressed right now, thank God. But if I did all the things on your recipe here, all the things, the actions that you're doing, and I did this for a couple of weeks, what do you think I'd feel? And 100% of the time they go, depressed. And I go, yes. So let's start changing up these patterns. Start doing certain things that move you toward resources which can help you, along with the other therapy interventions that we could do, to in a much faster way kind of transform the state that you're in. So there's a couple of things that we need to pay attention to as therapists. So if somebody comes in with a pattern, whether it's depression, anxiety, whatever, marital issues, child rearing, if there's something that they framed as a problem, we need to figure out 3 specific things. So the first thing I want to know is, when does the problem happen? When does the problem happen? Someone tells me that their child's acting out, and I want to know, when does the acting out happen? If they say, oh, it's only at school, well, that's giving us some information that there's some kind of pattern happening at school. If they say, oh, the kid's great at school, it's as soon as they get home, they turn into a little freaking hellion, Well, now we're getting more information. So they know that, acting out in school might not be the way to go. But now at home, that's the wonderful time to act like a little hellion. So, first thing, you when does it happen? Does it happen in the morning? Does it happen at night? Does it happen in the afternoon? Does it happen, in the middle of the night? Second, where does it happen? As we kind of mentioned, does it happen at school? Does it happen at home? Third, with whom does it happen? So, the child acting out, maybe the child only flips out when it's one particular parent. I mean, just this week, we had a kid come in who about drove me crazy. It wasn't even my client, but the kid was carrying on you wouldn't believe. Or maybe you would believe since you do this type of work. But just, get to the point where we thought we were going to have to ask, the parent to take the kid because it was disturbing the other client so much. But one of the other therapists go, it's funny. He never acts like that when his dad brings him. So part of the problem and the pattern is that the child does this when it's mom, apparently. So mom brought the kid. So when does it happen? Does it happen in the morning? Where does it happen? Does it happen at home? With whom does it happen? Does it happen only with mom, with dad, with teachers, or with everybody? So we need to initially figure this out. So if somebody comes in with depression, when does it happen? Are you depressed all the time? Now be careful here because people will definitely tell you that they're depressed all the time, even when they're not. So you might need to frame your question. Tell me about a time when you're not depressed. And if they can tell you a time that they're not depressed, even if it's 5 minutes, you got some info that you can utilize to, start, interrupting a pattern. But it may be that, 99.9% of the time they are depressed. So, when does it happen? If they say all the time, really make sure that it's all the time. Number 2, where does it happen? So are they mostly depressed when they're at home? Are they mostly depressed when they're at work? Are they depressed no matter if they're home or at their work? Are they mostly depressed, when they're in church? I don't know. It could be anywhere. I've been to some churches that were pretty depressing, but that's a whole different podcast. So moving along. So third, with whom does it happen? Are you depressed when you're around your friends? Are you depressed when you're with your spouse or your partner? Are you depressed when you're with your coworkers or your employees? Are you depressed, who else is involved in this? Or, so if we find out that, there's certain people that person's never depressed around, automatically we know that we might be able to utilize those people in an intervention. So number 1, when does it happen? Number 2, where does it happen? Number 3, with whom does it happen? And really, get in as much detail as possible when you're finding this information out. I don't take a lot of assessment info initially my first session, but when it comes to the patterns, I may want to learn something that's very, very minor. For example, I had a lady a couple of weeks ago who told me she was bulimic or participating in bulimic actions. Let's put it that way so we don't personalize it, identify it as her identity. And so I wanted to know specifically, when does she, do bulimia? Where does she do bulimia? And with whom does it happen? And then I wanted to know even more details. She causes herself to vomit. So I wanted to know how she did that. And she said, well, I put my finger down my throat. I wanted to know which hand. She said right hand. So right now I know, okay, the pattern of behavior is the right hand. I asked her if she could do it with the left hand. She said she thought she could. It would be awkward. So maybe, one of the interventions, which we kind of talked about, was if you're going to do that, you might want to do it, with your left hand. And she had 2 bathrooms, and she only did it in one bathroom. So if she's not going to stop it, maybe I need to move her to a different bathroom. I know it sounds like, oh, well, you're not dealing with the problem, but what we're trying to do is give her resources. Because if she sees that even in this extremely dangerous and dysfunctional behavior, she can alter one thing about it, that opens the mind to the presupposition that we can alter other things about it. Which, by the way, after she came back, she stated she hadn't done as much of the bulimic behavior since she started going to the other bathroom and using the left hand. Now, that may be totally coincidental, but I kind of like to think that maybe changing the pattern had a little something to do with it. So when we know when it happens, where it happens, and with whom it happens, we're getting basic information, and we need it in as much detail as possible. So now that we have that, if we want to create change in someone's behavior, I've got a couple of patterns of altering patterns, if you will, that have been really effective for me. And the cool thing about this is you can have fun with this. You could get them doing all these kind of crazy things that they'll wonder why in the world you're having them do it. But then after a few weeks, they start to see that their problem has changed. And sometimes it even disappears. So the first pattern is, if now that we know when it happens, we need to change when it happens. So if you're depressed mostly at night, maybe we need for you to set aside some time in the morning to be depressed. So we're actually encouraging the person to, you're going to be depressed anyway. So, change. Why don't you do that in the morning? And that way you can, kind of change the time a little bit. If they have a pattern of getting into arguments, let's say a marital couple, and it's usually after dinner, well, ask them to have their argument before dinner. Now, I know people who haven't done these kind of things, kind of scoff at it, but seriously, what it's doing is putting them in charge of the behavior that they have felt out of control about. So you're actually getting them to control the very thing that they feel out of control about. So if this couple says, every night we fight, and you find out that it's always after dinner they're fighting, well, tell them that they have to do their fight before dinner. They can't eat dinner until they fight. And it becomes kind of a paradoxical intervention. So, we're making them do the very behavior, but we're changing when it happens. So I'm sure this couple, if they're, so bad that they've got to come to therapy to fight, they can come up with something to fight about. They just need to do it before dinner. So when you change when the problem happens, that gives that person or those people access to more possibilities. Because if you only know how to do something one way, you're kind of limited. So when you change when it happens, this person's brain, it's a funny thing. It's, again, a paradox. It starts to open up to new possibilities that it can do more than it thought it could. It thought it only knew one way of responding, but it can be multiple ways of responding. I remember I worked with a boy years and years back who would he'd flip out when mom would come home from work. There's a whole history behind this. But the mom finally insisted, after we kind of coached her through this pattern change, that the boy have his flip out tantrums before she left for work. And what it ended up doing is it gave her power back, because she wanted him to have these tantrums now, whereas before she didn't. And if he actually had the tantrum, he was following mom's command, which he hadn't done earlier. He would refuse to pay attention to her, and she'd beg him to stop, and he'd keep going. So when she said, hey, I want you to do this before I leave for work, if the boy refused, well, that's okay, because funny thing is, he did less of the flipping out and arguing later in the evening, but she got some moments of peace. The second thing is that if he did do it, she was back in charge. So change when it happens. Change when the pattern happens. Number 2, change where it happens. I remember a story, and it's another Erickson story, where he had a client who he was always depressed, this client, and he couldn't seem to shake his depression. So Erickson told him, he had to follow a task. And, back when Erickson was practicing being a medical doctor, people did exactly what she told them to. It was kind of a golden era in some ways for these kind of interventions. But the man would sit at home and feel horribly depressed and just, not much quality of life. So Erickson told him, well, if you're going to be depressed anyway, I want you to get up every day and go to the library and sit in the library and be depressed, because you're going to be depressed sitting at home. I want you to might as well sit at the library. And the guy followed Erickson's directive. Within a week, he started finding magazines he liked to read and look at, and started seeing people and talking to people. And he eventually was in the process of investigating new hobbies. He started reading a magazine on spelunking, and I always been fascinated with caves. He ended up talking to another man who also had a similar interest, and then they had agreed that maybe they should, go explore some caves together. And so the man started doing that with his new friend. And so just by changing where the person was having this problem, Erickson gave the man access to new resources. Now, Erickson certainly wouldn't have known that the man would meet someone who's interested in exploring caves, but the pattern was to sit at home. So if you have a client that's anxious only in one place, maybe they need to be anxious at other places, or depressed in other places. Maybe this pattern that they have is so ingrained in that location that they need to change where they're having it. So the next one is that we want to change the duration of the pattern. Now this is where it gets kind of fun. If somebody's doing a certain behavioral action that they don't enjoy, that's causing them problems, if it's not something that's directly harmful to them, like, drug use and all of that, sometimes doing more of the problem can actually cause the client to decrease the problem. Let me give you an example. I once had a client who had this kind of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder thing, where anytime that he would go through a door, open or close a door, he would have to touch the door like 7 to 10 times. I can't remember the exact number, but we'll just say 7 times. Now, it wasn't that big a deal, but it was very worrisome, because anytime he went through a door, he had to tap on the door 7 times, or he'd start having this panic, these kind of panic attacks. So using this idea of changing the duration, instead of fighting and saying, okay, well, you need to stop it, let's do some exposure therapy and all of that, I told him it was fine to continue this pattern, but instead of 7, he needed to really tap on the doorknobs 30 times. So I got an agreement from him that he would, every time he'd go through a door, he would tap on it 30 times. Is that excessive? Of course it's excessive. So this didn't last too long. So he tried it for really about, I think he said, a day or two. And of course, everyone looking at him thinking he's crazy, probably didn't help him to continue the pattern. But what he found is after he did 30 times, it got to be a real hassle. And so he decreased to 30, he went down to 20. And then he went down to 26. And then he went down to 21. And then he went down to 15. And then he went down to 11. And then he went down to 5. And then he went down to 2. Now, by taking that pattern and changing the duration of it to where, it had to do more, something in his brain said, well, if you can do 30 and you can decrease the number from 30, well, you might be able to decrease the number from 7 to 2 to 1 to eventually stop. So, I mean, you can look at this as kind of an ordeal therapy like Jay Haley talked about, and I guess it has some of that too. But by changing the duration of it, this man got the resources that he could change something. Amping up that intensity. It's like sometimes when I have people who come for anxiety, and they're sitting in their seat and they're talking about the anxiety, and I ask them, where do they feel the anxiety? And they say, oh, I feel it in my chest. I said, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being no tension and 10 being a freak out session, where are you? And let's say they'll say a 7. I said, okay, now can you bring that up to a 7.5? I don't want you to do any more than that. Just bring it up to a 7.5. And sure enough, 90% of the time, the person can increase it up. And then if you feel you can go a little more, I say, take it up to an 8. I say, but this will be as intense just for a minute. Just take it to an 8. And they may bring it up to an 8. And then after they do that, okay, now take it back down to a 7.5. You'll take it down to a 7.5. And then, okay, now you can take it back to wherever you usually have it. And leave it at that and go on to talk about something else. Right there, you've shown them that the intensity they've adjusted. So if they can increase the intensity, they also saw that they could decrease the intensity. So even at that unconscious level, we're breaking the pattern by changing the duration. Oh, the most they could deal was the 7. So we took it up to 7.5 and to the intensity of 8 and then back to 7.5 because they're doing it. You're not. You're just saying, hey, can you do this? And they most of the time can be able to. So if somebody's feeling really anxious, say, look, I hate to do this, but just in order to find these things out, could you take that on this scale up 0.5%? Or how about just 1 full number? And then after a minute, go back and just see what happens, what's different about how they, experience that level of anxiety. Now, again, if they're having a full-out panic attack, I don't play with that. I mean, that goes without saying to me. Now, fourth one is to break up a pattern. Sometimes we need to add to the pattern, which in a way I kind of did. I added more knocks on the door knob to the previous example, but if somebody has a pattern of certain behaviors, sometimes adding extra things to the pattern can kind of free up resources. I remember a mom and a daughter who couldn't stop fighting, and they would bicker so much and yell so much. This would go on for hours a night. It got to the point to where the husband, the dad, got to where he would intentionally work late hours so he wouldn't have to come home because they just couldn't seem to break the pattern. So I made sure that when they were having the arguments, they had to be doing something else in addition to the arguments. So adding to the pattern, what I had them do is they could only have their arguments if they put their arms straight up toward the ceiling as if they were, trying to touch the ceiling. And here in the United States, it's like the touchdown from our game of football. And if they held their arms up that way, they could only argue that, using that their arms up. I mean, they could not argue if their arms were down. Now, there's a couple of things here. Number one, your arms get tired pretty quick. So by keeping their arms up, they'd tire pretty quickly, and so there'd actually be breaks in the pattern. So by adding an extra step to the pattern, it found out that they were able to start having small breaks because, mom and daughter would have their arms up, and then one would start to bring their arms down, and that was the signal they had to quit. And I put Dad, by the way, I got him out of working late, and he had to come home and referee this, which he did with so much glee. He really enjoyed it. I even joked about getting a whistle for him to blow because he'd sit there and watch him, and then he'd tell his daughter, all right, daughter, no, your arms are dropping. You just got to stop arguing until your arms go straight up. Now, honey, mom, no, your arms are, so y'all got to stop arguing. So by adding that to the process, they started to get little breaks in the pattern, and it started giving the resources that, they still wanted to talk about stuff, but they had to find new ways to interact since they couldn't keep holding their arms up for hours and hours a night. I remember another Erickson story. Erickson had a policeman or a retired policeman who had a drinking problem. He liked to drink a lot of beer. So Erickson told him that he could drink all the beer he wanted. He just could only drink one beer at a time, and he could only buy one beer at a time. And the third part is that he had to walk to the store to get it. So he couldn't go buy a six-pack. He only could buy one beer, bring the beer home, drink it. If he wanted another beer, he'd have to walk all the way back to the store. And the store is about, a mile and a half away. So the guy's like, no big deal. But within a couple of days, he was getting pretty tired of all the walking. But the other thing was there was a break in between the consumption of alcohol. Whereas he could have bought a 6-pack, 12-pack, and just gone right through them. Now he had to walk somewhere, pick up the beer, bring it home, drink it, walk back, buy the beer, bring it home, drink it. So there's, again, a breakup in the pattern, which leads us to our fifth pattern alteration, which is known as breaking up the pattern. We get in reactive ways of responding to stimuli sometimes, particularly in how we interact with other people, in our families, in our work. And it seems like they happen all by themselves. But having those little breaks in the pattern lets our brain know that we have access to resources on how to manage our emotional state a little bit better. So when somebody's doing something, if we break that pattern up, they find that they now have options. I remember a lady who had an OCD, and she had to knock on the walls when she heard certain things. And it was a certain number of times. So I told her she could certainly knock on the wall, but between every knock, she had to do a jumping jack. So she would, let's say she had to knock 5 times. So she had to knock once, jumping jack, knock twice, jumping jack, knock for the 3rd time, jumping jack. So by breaking up the pattern, she found that, she wasn't needing to knock as much. And eventually she even decreased her need to knock on the wall. And again, this is without doing any in-depth insight therapy or anything like that, just strictly behavioral interventions. A lot of times couples, when they are in the midst of interacting, there's such a habitual way of responding to each other that they forget that they have a choice on how that they want to interact. So I remember I had a couple who was arguing so much that the intensity of it was surprising to me, because they did it in front of me in the first session. I mean, within 5 minutes, I've never had a couple argue like this. I wasn't worried about, the violence, but it just got so loud and so intense. And, sometimes I'll let them argue because, I want to see what's going on. It just kind of helps me see patterns, But after a while, it just kept going, and it was getting louder and louder, and my God, it was getting louder. And so finally, I'm going like, hey, all right, okay, guys, stop. Okay, stop. Hey, guys, it's my room, please. It's like I wasn't even there. I mean, this is a couple that was so into their pattern, man. I'll give them credit. They knew how to do a pattern. And I was not even there. They were just going and, into it, and just the venom and the intensity. So I decided that I had to do something pretty radical to break this pattern. So what I did was, as they were yelling and screaming at each other, I grabbed my throat and started choking. Started acting like I was choking. And a second or two later, they just stopped, and I was really going in. I was really choking. And they looked at me, and they're like, "Oh, are you okay?" And I'm choked for another minute, and they said, yeah, I'm fine. I don't know what happened to me. I was just with my throat there. I got a little scared. And then there was no arguing for a second or two, and it was calming down. And so I started talking. I see you guys have a pattern of interacting that's just like this trigger that you get into it. And I mean, before I even got that out of my mouth, bang, they were right back in it. They were just yeah, well, because she, and oh, yeah, well, because he, and it just went into this. And again, I wasn't there. So I started choking again. And they stopped and, are you sure you're okay? I said, it must be the arguing. I get choked up when people argue. And they kind of looked at me and they're a little irritated with me because, yeah, I guess I'd scared them. So I said, all right, well, now that we've calmed down, and for about a couple of minutes, we were talking. Then next thing he said something, and it kicked up again. So I started choking. They ignored me this time. So I choked louder. And finally, I would say I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I'm not. I actually wrote about this in a book. I was having so much fun with this. I grabbed my throat and threw myself in the floor and choked and kicked my legs out. I mean, this is how crazy these folks were that I had to do to this extent. And then they stopped and they looked at me and they looked at each other. And I know that look. The look is, I don't know who's crazier, us or this shrink. Because I see it a lot of times. And so I climbed back in my chair. And I said, you guys are killing me. And then they started smiling, started, looking at me a little different. Okay, something's going on here. So we started talking about breaking in the pattern. And anytime I started to hear a little rise in one of their voice, I went to put my hands around my throat as if I was choking, and they caught themselves. They were like, oh, you're going to do it again, right? It's like they were so ingrained in this pattern that they automatically would just go right into it. But then they saw that, there's something else going on, and it started breaking up their pattern. So by the end of the session, they were talking, and every now and then they'd kind of look over at me. I kind of sense they'd start getting irritated with each other, and they'd look over at me, and I'd kind of smile. And I remember one of the last things we said in that session is that the wife said something in good-natured fun, like a ribbing toward the husband. He laughed, but before he laughed, he kind of looked at her, and then she grabbed her own throat like she was going to choke, and that kind of cracked everybody up. And when they came back a couple of weeks later, they found that, man, they were still doing some arguing, but they found that they actually argued less. And it was something about that session that they were able to really begin to pay attention to this pattern that they hadn't paid attention before. And they even caught each other, when there's one of them starting getting upset, the other would pretend to choke, and, they'd kind of chuckle, or, one would storm out and the other one wouldn't, chasing them with the fight, continuing and all of that. So breaking up that pattern, just small little breaks that, my putting on a show to just have them cease what they were doing was enough to give them the resources to become aware of the pattern. Because when you become aware of the pattern is how you can, help alter it. So let's do a recap. Change when the problem happens. Change when the pattern happens. Change where the pattern happens. Change how long the pattern happens. If somebody's doing some kind of habit or some kind of action that's negative, if it's not detrimental to their health, change the duration of it. Number 4, adding to the pattern. So if they're going to do it anyway, which a lot of times they are, have them do extra things. So because they're doing extra things, it's indirectly changing the pattern. And 5, breaking up the pattern. So if they're going to argue or feel bad, or, they're going to lie in the bed and be depressed, tell them they can lie in the bed to be depressed, but every 30 minutes they have to get up out of the bed and walk around the house 5 times, and then they get back in the bed. And they have to do this all day. And again, it's just breaking up the pattern, doing something to break up the pattern. Find out when it happens, where it happens, with whom it happens, and just start experimenting. See what happens with this. Now, I've had the pleasure of playing with patterns in all types of mental health cases, and I found that behavioristic component can actually cause more shifts to the person's thinking and the person's emotion than the kind of the traditional insight oriented therapy. So if you want to combine them, that's cool, but I think you got to get your patients doing rather than being. Because when they become their problem, they can't change that. But when they're doing the problem, that means that they're have the ability to do something else. So when you give them the ability to do something else, get away from being and get into doing by altering patterns with these simple methods I'm giving you, and get really playful with it. You have to have good rapport. You may find that a lot of things happen all on their own. So just having somebody, get up and walk around their house, for 5 minutes every hour could create a really surprising shift in them. Or it may not, but at least you're getting them to do something different. Because if they keep doing the same thing that they're doing, they'll continue getting the same result they've been getting. So try to incorporate a little more of the behavioral changes and get playful with it and get creative with it. What resources does this person need? And then move them toward those resources by kind of shifting up the pattern. If the recipe for feeling a certain way involves all these actions, then do new actions. If they isolate themselves because they're depressed, get them out of the house, burn the freaking couch, get out in the world. If they're not interacting, say, okay, you have to go out and do some volunteer work, or you have to go call somebody, or you have to go see somebody you haven't seen in a while. If they're not moving at all, again, 5 minutes around the house every hour, or you have to go to the gym, or whatever it is, depending on the person. But getting them to alter the patterns. And if you spend as much time on the patterns, maybe more, than some of the other things that you might have done, you may find that your effectiveness as a therapist just really kicks up into high gear, because we want to work with all aspects of the person and not just get limited in only one way of approaching a client. So, with that being said, my pattern of talking into this microphone when I do this podcast is over. Thank you so much for listening to Potential Not Pathology. I hope you got some interesting ideas, and I would love to hear from you. And let me know some of your success stories. And I always enjoy hearing from people who take some of these ideas and make it work for them. Good luck to you in your work, and have an absolutely fantastic day.
Thank you for listening to Potential Not Pathology with Dr. Paul J. Leslie. If you enjoyed the show, check out our website at potentialnotpathology.com, where you will find programs and articles showcasing unique and creative therapeutic applications.